We are back, and we are joined now by Manpreet Kaur, development, economics, and legal scholar, founder of Art of Citizenry, co-author of this piece in These Times, along with Anna Canning, entitled "The Landmark Ruling Against Chiquita Exposes the Failure of Voluntary Corporate Social Responsibility." Manpreet, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and creating space for this important conversation.
Absolutely. So, tell us a little bit about this case here. It's involving Chiquita Brands International. It's been a long, long fight, 17 years here. And it finally just came to its conclusion 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, so conclusion-esque, I suppose. This landmark verdict marks the first time that a U.S. corporation has been held liable for committing human rights abuses abroad, which means that it's a really important case for all of us working in the realm of business and human rights, and advocating for worker rights and looking at supply chain accountability. This verdict is, as you mentioned, a culmination of a 17-year-long litigation. And, I think that this is a perfect example about how multinational corporations have the time, bandwidth, and resources to really make sure that this case continues to go on, and create these mechanisms to, in many ways, make it very challenging for victims and families to actually seek out remedies. So this case ultimately holds Chiquita Brands International, one of the largest banana distributors in the world, responsible for wrongful deaths of 8 individuals who were murdered by the paramilitary group AUC in Colombia. The jury in this case awarded the surviving family members $38.3 million in damages. And what's important to note here is that this case, we've seen different cases go out in throughout American legal history. And the reality is that as economies continue to globalize, multinational corporations have been able to really operate without much accountability for human rights abuses abroad in their supply chains. So Chiquita financed the AUC during the late 1990s through early 2000s. During this time, the AUC was declared a foreign terrorist organization by the U.S. Department of State, and Chiquita continued to pay them even after that designation. So this is really important to know. What really served as the linchpin for the suit that we saw is that during a 2009 criminal suit brought under the Anti-Terrorism Act by the Department of Justice, Chiquita pleaded guilty to paying the AUC for security services. And that suit by the federal government, and particularly the fact that Chiquita admitted to paying the AUC, was, I would say, really did facilitate what we saw unfold earlier this month during the civil suit.
So the AUC, can you explain to our audience, it's an acronym for what translates to the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. Our audience may have heard, has, I think, definitely heard the term death squads before. If you could just explain what this group was.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the AUC is a designated terrorist organization. They are a death squad, and the plaintiffs in this case have long alleged that the AUC is a violent organization responsible for torture, forced disappearances, war crimes, and other human rights violations. It's important to note there is an organization called Global Witness, and in their 2023 report, Global Witness documented that Colombia sees the most violence against human rights defenders globally. And so it's important to note that these are paramilitary, the AUC is a paramilitary organization. They have been around, they have backed immense war crimes, widespread atrocities, and the death of thousands of civilians. So when we're looking at why this case is so important, we have to realize that Chiquita was paying a organization that they knew was involved in furthering human rights violations in Colombia, primarily to protect their profit and bottom line.
Right. And I mean, this group was basically massacring communists, leftists, and I also should note that Israeli forces helped train these guys. So just another, whatever, just weird part of history. They ended up being designated as a terrorist organization in the United States, but that was after doing a lot of bloodshed to protect really capitalist interests in Colombia, that's why Chiquita was funding them.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's, as you said, everything is very interconnected. And as you start unfolding the different layers to this case, and quite frankly, most cases that involve multinational corporations, we know that in the global, as the global economy continues to expand, we have seen a demand over the last couple of decades for accountability, for transparency, and most of all, for justice. Multinationals have built these very complex supply chains that allow them to distance themselves from the human rights violations they are fundamentally enabling. And that enabling can happen through funding paramilitary organizations. It's important to note that throughout this case, we have heard of plaintiffs alleging that the AUC was paid by Chiquita to stifle dissent when workers tried to unionize, and that union leaders were killed by the AUC. So at the end of the day, this is not a case where we can necessarily say Chiquita was ignorant to what was happening in their supply chain, as so many companies love to claim, I'm claiming ignorance. That was a subsidiary. We're distanced. And that parent company to subsidiary relationship has allowed many multinationals to continue to operate in and enable very harmful environments within their supply chain.
Yeah, well, the what's amazing in your piece, you like they got caught, they were fined, but I'm not actually sure about the sequencing. But then they continued to pay these groups through basically a subsidiary called Banadex, where they had less oversight, and it just wasn't clearly coming from Chiquita itself.
I mean, I think what's interesting is that it was basically a line item in their budget, right? So these payments were line items, and I think that what's important is that if you look, I highly recommend anyone who's listening and is really interested in diving deeper into this case. In our piece, Anna and I actually linked to the DOJ, the original DOJ documentation. And it's such an interesting, just a simple, small page on the website to actually read, because what we see is that not only did Chiquita know of what they were doing, they continued to do it, right? And that is what blows my mind, is the complicity in these scenarios is what we have to be vigilant about. And it actually opens us up to this realization that this area of law, as far as corporate accountability is concerned, really needs to be fleshed out further. We have a very serious need for making sure that host countries and home countries, so host countries being the countries that corporations are operating in, and home countries being the countries where corporations are based, are taking responsibility of making sure that there are mechanisms in place to hold these companies accountable for their harms.
Well, I mean, part of the horror of this history here is that, I mean, the United States was complicit in a lot of, this violence, right? And probably built Chiquita up to a level where basically they had so much money and power after the United States was backing coups and violence on behalf of their capitalist interests, right? Like that happened in the 50s and the 60s and 70s. And then they're so powerful and so entrenched in a lot of these Latin American countries that the United States can be like, okay, we're hands off at this point. So Chiquita, you can just keep funding these far right paramilitary groups in, the later 20th century, and they'll settle. They now have settled eventually, but that's a pretty paltry sum for people in like who had their family members killed by this company, pretty directly.
Yeah, I mean, these abuses are not the first time that Chiquita has been complicit in mass human rights violations throughout the company's history. And I think it's important to recognize that Chiquita was not always Chiquita. Before Chiquita was Chiquita, it was the United Fruit Company.
Yeah.
And to me, this is a great example of how companies like to rebrand to distance themselves from their history and the violations and mass atrocities that they have enabled, facilitated, and basically financially underwritten. So it's important to recognize that the United Food Company, throughout the early, around 1928, I believe, the UFC orchestrated a massacre of over 1,000 striking workers in Colombia who were being paid $1 a month. And when we talk about the role that companies have, we have to realize that the power multinational corporations have to control international investment has had enormous bearing on the economies of global South countries. We have seen these countries face pressure to attract foreign investment, and that means that even governments in the South have little or no alternative but to be receptive to the terms of multinationals in order to attract that investment. And that's, this very vicious cycle, or this very deep power differential has enabled things such as minimum wages being set so unrealistically low, minimum government oversight, and there are multinationals with operating budgets that are higher than some countries. So I think that it's important to recognize the power difference that we're seeing. Perhaps and you talked about this a bit earlier, is the United States government is equally complicit. And so the U.S. overthrew a democratically elected government in Guatemala in the 1950s. And that was essentially protecting the United Fruit Company's grasp on the nation's economy. And so this idea of how companies, countries, and global power structures are so interconnected is incredibly important for us to realize, because we cannot separate that from even the case that we're seeing unfold currently and the future cases that we will continue to see unfold.
And so lastly there, what is the kind of precedent that this sets going forward for corporate accountability? From your perspective, is this a step forward, or is this something where, say, the DOJ is going to treat as an outlier? Yeah.
It can go anyway. And I think this is the thing with law is we will see, is an often used phrase. But I think that, in my personal opinion, I think that this is a really important case. It really does start making a case for more regulations. I mean, we've seen the EU just recently pass the CSDDD, which is about supply chains and regulating supply chains. And so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, essentially is starting to make it mandatory for multinationals to start regulating their supply chains more and seeing what is their environmental footprint, what is their social footprint. The issue right now is that we have become so dependent on third-party certifications in order to allow multinationals in some way to voluntarily self-regulate themselves. And I think we can all agree that anything that is voluntary and doesn't align with the bottom line of profit maximization for shareholders is going to not necessarily be a priority for any board or any corporation that is that cares about profit maximization. And so I think to me, in this case is particularly illustrative of the fact that countries are recognizing the need for more governance. And we have this moment or this window of opportunity to recognizing that we do need more regulatory action. We currently have very soft law mechanisms, such as the third-party certifications. In the case of Chiquita, we saw Chiquita had the Rainforest Alliance certification, which allowed them to effectively continue to operate while saying they're doing good or are ethical. And so governments are going to realize that there is a need for regulating, and courts are going to continue to offer or need to start offering or will be offering those avenues for remedy. To me, I think that this case is really starting to open the ability for lawyers to also, and legal teams to think creatively about how they can pursue cases within the legal system and bring more suits against companies who have continued to hide behind their corporate veils. And those corporate veils, it's time that we start piercing those.
Well, agreed on all fronts. Manpreet Kaur, the book is called The Landmark Ruling Against Chiquita Exposes the Failure of Voluntary Corporate Social Responsibility. We will put a link to that wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.